The sign had been nailed to the post outside Dawson's General Store for 11 days before anyone said a word about it to Caleb Thornton's face. It was written in his own hand, blocky letters pressed hard into a scrap of pine board with a carpenter's pencil, and it read, "Wife wanted. Any woman willing. No questions asked." Below it, he'd written his name, the direction to his ranch, and a single line that made every woman in Copper Bluff either laugh or shake her head. "I'll marry the woman nobody wants." The men in town thought it was a joke. The women thought it was a trap. And the preacher, old Reverend Calloway, told his wife over supper that it was the saddest thing he'd read since the obituaries came in from the war. But Caleb wasn't joking. He was 53 years old, and he had run out of ways to pretend that silence was the same thing as peace. He'd come to Copper Bluff 9 years earlier with a dead wife's ring in his coat pocket and a deed to 200 acres of open range that his brother had left him after dying of pneumonia in a boarding house in Cheyenne. The land was good. Grass country, with a creek that ran clear through spring and most of summer, and a hill to the north that broke the worst of the winter wind. He'd built the cabin himself. Split the logs, dug the foundation, set the chimney stones one by one until the mortar cracked his knuckles raw. It was a solid place, a quiet place, and for a while that had been enough. He told himself it was enough. A man didn't need much. Coffee in the morning, work until the light gave out, a fire at night, and the sound of the creek through the window when the wind was still. He told himself that for 9 years, and for 9 years the cabin believed him, even if his chest didn't. It was Clara who finally broke something open in him, though she didn't mean to. Clara Parson ran the boarding house in town, and she'd brought a plate of food to the post office the day Caleb came in for supplies. She set it down on the counter, and her little girl, no more than 4, had looked up at Caleb and said, "Are you somebody's daddy?" He'd said no, and the girl had frowned like that was the strangest thing she'd ever heard. He thought about it the whole ride home. He thought about it while he unsaddled the horse, while he boiled his beans, while he sat in the chair by the fire and listened to the logs pop and hiss. Are you somebody's daddy? No, he wasn't somebody's daddy. He wasn't somebody's husband. He wasn't somebody's anything. And for the first time in 9 years, that fact didn't feel like freedom. It felt like dying slowly in a room that nobody would think to check. So he made the sign. He didn't write it for the pretty women or the young ones. He didn't write it for the widows with means or the churchwomen with reputations to protect. He wrote it for whoever was left, whoever had been passed over, turned away, spoken about in whispers, whoever had stopped believing that someone might choose them. He nailed it to the post on a Tuesday morning, bought his flour and salt, and rode home without looking anyone in the eye. And for 11 days, nothing happened. A few boys threw mud at the sign. Someone scratched a crude picture beneath it. The barber made a joke about it loud enough for the whole street to hear. But no one came. No one rode out to the ranch. No one left a letter. And Caleb began to feel the slow, familiar weight of something he didn't have a word for, but that lived in the space between his ribs like a stone he couldn't cough up. Then, on the 12th morning, she came. He was on the porch mending a harness strap when he saw the figure on the road. It was early, just past dawn, and the light was flat and gray and the dust hadn't risen yet. She was walking. No horse, no wagon, no companion, just a woman in a faded calico dress with a cloth bundle under one arm, moving steadily up the road toward his gate. He set the harness down and stood. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just kept walking until she reached the fence, and then she stopped and looked at him across 30 feet of dirt yard with an expression he couldn't read. She was maybe 30, though something about the way she held herself made her seem older. Not tired, harder. Like wood that had been left out in weather until it stopped being soft but hadn't yet started to rot. Her hair was dark and pulled back tight, and there was a scar on her face. A long one. It started just below her left ear and ran down her jaw and along the side of her neck until it disappeared beneath the collar of her dress. It was old and pale, and she made no effort to hide it. "You the one who put up that sign?" she said. Her voice was low, steady, with no warmth in it and no hostility either. Just a voice doing its job. Caleb nodded. "I am." She looked at the cabin behind him, then at the barn, then at the hills beyond. "You said, 'Any woman willing,'" she said. "You meant that?" "I did." "Then I'm here." He didn't know what he'd expected. He'd thought about it in the vague, shapeless way a man thinks about things he doesn't believe will actually happen. Maybe a widow with children. Maybe an older woman with nowhere else to go. He hadn't thought about what he'd do when someone actually stood in front of him and said the words. He hadn't thought about what it would feel like to look into a stranger's eyes and know that this was the moment where the rest of his life either started or didn't. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nettie Groves." "Where'd you come from?" "South. Doesn't matter where." He looked at the scar. He didn't mean to, but it was there, and she caught him looking. Her chin lifted slightly, not in anger, but in something more practiced than anger. She'd been looked at before. She'd been looked at 1,000 times. "You want to know about this?" she said, touching her jaw with 2 fingers. "Only if you want to tell me." Something shifted in her face. It wasn't a softening. It was more like a door that had been braced shut from the inside, easing back 1/2 inch. Not open, just less closed. "I don't," she said. "Not today." "Then come inside," Caleb said. "I'll put coffee on." By the way, if this story is pulling you in, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. We love knowing which corners of the world our stories reach. Now, let's get back to Caleb and Nettie. She didn't sit right away. She stood in the center of the cabin and looked at everything the way a person looks at a room they're trying to decide whether to trust. The stove, the table, the single chair, the bed in the corner with the wool blanket folded square at the foot, the shelf with the tin cups and the jar of flour, and the Bible his mother had given him 40 years ago. She looked at all of it, and he could see her calculating, not whether it was enough. She didn't seem like a woman who cared about enough. She was calculating whether it was safe. "You live alone," she said. It wasn't a question. 9 years. "Why?" "My wife died before I came here. Fever took her in '62. I never looked for another. Until now. Until now." She sat. He poured coffee. And for a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The creek murmured outside. A horse stamped in the barn. It was the most noise Caleb's cabin had held in 9 years, and somehow it was still mostly silence. Over the next week, they built something that wasn't quite a marriage and wasn't quite an arrangement, but lived somewhere in the territory between. Caleb gave her the bed and slept on a pallet by the stove. She didn't argue. She didn't thank him either. She rose before he did every morning, and by the time he was up, the fire was lit, the coffee was boiled, and there was cornbread on the table. She worked without being asked. She mended the fence where the wire had sagged, weeded the small garden he'd half abandoned, and reorganized the root cellar so efficiently that he found things he'd forgotten he owned. She moved through the days like someone who had learned that if you kept your hands busy, your mind couldn't drag you down. Caleb recognized it because he'd done the same thing for years. They didn't talk much at first. He told her the boundaries of the property, where the water ran fastest, which pasture to avoid in spring because the ground went soft. She listened and remembered everything. When he showed her the tool shed, she picked up the handsaw and checked the teeth like someone who'd used one before. When he showed her where the firewood was stacked, she told him the pile was too close to the cabin wall and that he should move it 6 feet out to keep the moisture from rotting the lower logs. He looked at her and she looked back, not apologetic, not challenging, just correct. And he moved the woodpile the next morning. On the 4th night, she told him about the scar. They were sitting by the fire after supper, and she said it the way a person reads a list. No emotion, no pausing for breath. Her father had done it. He'd been a drunk and a bitter man, and when she was 17, he'd come home from the saloon and found her reading a book a school teacher had lent her, and he'd said that reading would make her uppity, and no man would want an uppity wife. She'd said she didn't want a husband like him, and he'd hit her with a bottle, and when she fell, he'd taken a piece of it and cut her face, and told her now no man would want her at all. She'd left that night, walked 12 miles in the dark to the schoolteacher's house. The teacher cleaned the wound, but it was too deep to close properly, and it healed the way it healed, and Nettie had carried it on her face every day since, like a sentence she hadn't committed the crime for. Caleb sat still through the whole telling. When she was done, he didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say it wasn't her fault. He didn't say any of the things men say when they don't know what to say. He looked at the fire for a long time, and then he said, "That teacher, were they kind to you?" Nettie blinked. It was the first time he'd seen her caught off guard. "Yes," she said. "She was kind. She let me stay 3 years, taught me to read proper, to figure numbers, to set a broken bone. She's the reason I can do what I can do." "Then she gave you something your father never could," Caleb said. "And that scar is his failure, not yours." Nettie didn't cry. She didn't even change expression, but her hand, which had been gripping the edge of the chair so hard her knuckles were white, slowly opened, and she set it flat on the table, palm down, like she was laying something to rest. They didn't speak again that night, but something had shifted. Not the way it shifts in stories where a woman falls into a man's arms and the music swells. It shifted the way a frozen river shifts in early spring. You don't see it happen. You just notice one morning that the water is moving where it wasn't before. The town found out about Nettie on market day. Caleb brought her with him to load supplies, and by the time they'd walked from the wagon to the general store, every eye on the street was on her face. He saw the way they looked. First at the scar, then at each other, then back at the scar. He heard the whisper from the barber's porch before they were even past it. That's what answered his sign, "Lord have mercy." Nettie heard it too. She didn't turn her head. She walked into the store with her shoulders square and her eyes forward, and she bought salt, lard, thread, and a tin of peaches without once lowering her voice or her gaze. But on the ride home she was quiet, and her quiet was different from her usual quiet. It had weight to it. He drove the wagon for 2 miles before he spoke. "What they said back there, I know what they said. It doesn't mean anything." She looked at him. "It means everything, Caleb. It's meant everything my whole life. Every room I walk into, every person I meet, every job I've tried to hold. That scar walks in before I do. It always has." He wanted to argue. He wanted to say it didn't matter, that people would see past it. But he was 53 years old, and he'd been lonely long enough to stop lying to himself about how the world worked. So instead he said, "You're right. They see it first. But I didn't put that sign up for them. I put it up for you. And what I see first is that my woodpile is in the right place for the first time in 9 years." She didn't laugh, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way he hadn't seen before. It wasn't a smile. It was the place where a smile might one day decide to live. 3 weeks passed. The days took on a rhythm that Caleb hadn't known he was missing. Coffee before dawn, work through the morning, a meal at midday where they sat across from each other at the table, and sometimes talked, and sometimes didn't. Afternoons, she worked the garden while he rode the fences. Evenings, they sat by the fire and she read aloud from the Bible while he whittled pegs for the gate hinge. She read well. Her voice had a steadiness to it that made the old words feel less like sermons and more like someone telling you something they'd figured out on their own. He found himself listening not to the scripture, but to her. The way she paused before certain verses, the way her voice dropped when something mattered to her, the way she sometimes stopped and looked at the fire and said nothing for a full minute before turning the page. He hadn't told her yet that he thought she was remarkable. He hadn't told her that watching her split kindling with the same calm focus she brought to everything made him feel something he'd thought he'd buried with his first wife. He hadn't told her because he didn't know how. He was 53, and he'd spent 9 years building a life around not needing anyone, and now he needed someone, and the words for that were somewhere he couldn't reach them. So he said it in other ways. He built a second chair. He hung a shelf beside the bed for her books. He fixed the window in the loft that had been cracked for years because she mentioned once that she liked the sound of rain, but not the feel of it coming through the glass. Then Emmett Groves came. She was in the garden when the rider appeared on the south road.
Caleb was in the barn and didn't see him at first. He heard the horse first, then Nettie's voice, not shouting, not panicked, but flat and cold in a way he'd never heard it before. He came out of the barn and saw a man on a gray horse at the gate. The man was thin and hard-looking, maybe 60, with a sunken face and hands that didn't sit still. His eyes were bloodshot and his clothes were road-worn, and there was a smell about him, even from 20 feet, that was sour and stale. Nettie stood between the garden and the gate with a hoe in both hands, not raised, just held, the way you hold something when you want to remember you have it. "That's him," she said to Caleb without turning around. "That's my father." Emmett Groves smiled. It was the worst smile Caleb had ever seen. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it was familiar. It was the smile of a man who had spent his whole life believing that what he owned was the same as what he loved. "Nettie girl," Emmett said, "been looking for you a long time. You should have stopped looking. Now that's no way to talk to your father. I rode 400 miles. I'm tired. I'm hungry. And I hear you've gone and shacked up with some old rancher who couldn't find a real woman." Caleb stepped forward. He didn't hurry. He didn't clench his fists. He just walked to the gate and stood next to Nettie and looked at the man on the horse the way he'd look at a coyote circling the henhouse. Quiet, patient, ready. "You're on my land," Caleb said, "and that's my daughter. She's a grown woman. She's here by her own choosing." Emmett leaned forward in the saddle. "She's here because she's got no place else. You think she wants to be here? Look at her. She's damaged goods, always has been. I'm offering to take her off your hands." "Nobody asked you to." "I'm her blood." "Blood doesn't mean what you think it means," Caleb said. "Not when you're the one who spilled it." Emmett's smile disappeared. His hand moved to his belt, where a knife handle showed above the leather. Nettie didn't flinch. She'd seen that hand move before. She'd seen where it landed. But this time she wasn't 17, and she wasn't alone, and she wasn't reading a book in a dark kitchen waiting for something bad to happen. She was standing in a garden she'd planted with her own hands, next to a man who'd built her a chair. "You leave now," Nettie said, "or I swear before God you won't leave at all." Emmett looked at her, then at Caleb, then at the hoe in her hands and the set of her jaw, and something in her eyes that he'd never seen before because he'd never looked long enough to see it. He saw it now, and whatever it was bigger than him. He rode out without another word. They watched until he was a smudge on the southern horizon, and then Nettie drove the hoe into the dirt and left it standing there like a flag planted in claimed ground. She walked into the cabin, and Caleb heard the sound he'd never heard from her before. She was crying. Not loudly. Not the way people cry in stories. The way people cry when they've held something for 15 years and their arms have finally given out. He didn't go in right away. He gave her the time the way he'd give a horse room after a scare. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that some things needed space before they needed company. He waited until the sound stopped. Then he went inside and put the kettle on and sat across from her and said nothing at all. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him with red eyes and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know." "Why did you?" He thought about it, really thought about it. And then he said the truest thing he'd ever said in his 53 years of living.
Because I put up a sign that said I'd marry the woman nobody wanted. And the woman who showed up is the only person who ever made this cabin feel like it had a reason to be standing. Nettie looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. It was the first time they had touched. His hand was rough and cracked, and hers was strong and calloused. And neither of them was young, and neither of them was beautiful, the way the world counts beauty. But in that kitchen, in that light, with the fire going and the creek running outside, they were exactly what the other one needed. And that was more than enough. Reverend Calloway married them on a Sunday in October. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt, and Nettie wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd bought with egg money. The whole town came, not because they approved, but because they were curious. And what they saw wasn't a joke or a trap or a sad man settling. What they saw was a man looking at a woman like she'd hung the stars, and a woman standing at an altar with her scar in full view, and her head held high, and her hand steady in his. 3 years later, the cabin had grown. A second room for the winter stores, a covered porch where they sat in the evenings, a dog that had wandered in one spring and never left, and a small school Nettie ran twice a week from the front room, where she taught 6 children from the neighboring ranches to read and figure and think for themselves.